At a grim frontier auction where sick and unwanted children are treated as burdens, a rugged mountain man steps forward and claims the frailest boy no one else wants. The crowd scoffs, certain the child will not survive the harsh mountain winter ahead. But under the mountain man's patient care, something remarkable begins to happen. The boy who could barely lift his head starts to sit up. The child who couldn't keep food down begins to eat. Slowly, week by week, color returns to his pale cheeks and strength flows back into his tiny frame. Then one quiet evening by the firelight, after months of silence, the boy speaks his first word. It's not Papa or thank you as anyone might expect. The single word he whispers changes everything they thought they knew about his past. What word could a sick child speak that would shock a hardened mountain man to his core? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of desperation through the dusty streets of Timber Creek, Montana territory. On the makeshift platform of weathered pine boards, families stood in clusters, their faces etched with the kind of hardship that comes from watching hope drain away like water through cupped hands. The year was 1884, and the early frost had killed crops across 3 counties, leaving parents with impossible choices. Ezra McClellan stood at the edge of the crowd, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the auction ground. At 52, his beard had gone mostly gray, and deep lines mapped the geography of a life spent alone in the high country. He'd come to town for supplies, not expecting to witness this particular brand of human suffering. "Next lot," called the auctioneer, a thin man whose voice had grown hoarse from a morning of selling children like livestock. Boy approximately 8 years old. Been sick, but he's breathing steady. A murmur rippled through the assembled bidders. Most were looking for healthy children who could work, who could justify the cost of feeding through the winter. The boy they brought forward was nothing more than skin stretched over delicate bones, his dark hair matted with fever sweat. His eyes, though sunken, held an intelligence that seemed too old for his small face. Ezra watched as the child's thin fingers clutched a small leather pouch against his chest. Even in his weakened state, the boy protected this single possession with fierce determination. The medicine bag was worn smooth by countless hands, its leather darkened with age and use. "Do I hear 50 cents?" the auctioneer tried, but the crowd remained silent. These people needed workers, not another mouth to feed. 25 cents. Anyone? The boy swayed on his feet, and for a moment Ezra thought he might collapse right there on the platform. Something in that moment of vulnerability struck deep into places Ezra had thought long dead. He remembered his own children, lost to influenza 5 winters past, and how helpless he'd felt watching them fade, despite all his mountain remedies. "I'll take him," Ezra's voice cut through the silence like an axe through pine. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The crowd knew Ezra by reputation, if not by sight, the hermit who lived high in the Beartooth Mountains, who came to town maybe twice a year for supplies and spoke to no one unless spoken to first. "Sir, this child is quite ill," the auctioneer said, surprised to have any bidder at all. "We can't guarantee he'll survive the week." "Neither can you guarantee any of us will," Ezra replied, fishing coins from his leather pouch. "What's your price?" $2 would take him. Ezra counted out the money without hesitation. Around him the crowd began to whisper. Old Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. Young Tom Bradley muttered something about throwing good money after bad. But Ezra had stopped listening to other people's opinions the day he buried his wife and children. He approached the platform where the boy stood trembling. Up close, the child looked even more fragile, his skin pale as birch bark, his breathing shallow and quick. But those eyes, dark as mountain pools, fixed on Ezra with something that might have been hope. "Can you walk, son?" Ezra asked gently. The boy nodded, though his legs shook with the effort of standing. Ezra reached out slowly, the way he'd approach a wounded animal, and lifted the child into his arms. The boy weighed no more than a sack of flour, and Ezra could feel every rib through the thin fabric of his torn shirt. As they left the auction ground, Ezra heard the whispered predictions following them like smoke. The boy wouldn't last the journey to the mountains. Even if he did, winter was coming, and sick children didn't survive mountain winters. Ezra had just wasted $2 on a burial. But as Ezra settled the boy onto his horse and felt those small arms wrap around his waist with surprising strength, he wondered if perhaps the townspeople had it backward. Maybe it wasn't the boy who needed saving. Maybe it was the mountain man who'd been dying slowly, one lonely winter at a time, who finally had a reason to live again. The mountain trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves whispering secrets in the thin air. Ezra's horse picked its way carefully along the narrow path, each step measured and sure, despite the precious burden they carried. The boy had fallen unconscious within the first hour of their journey, his small body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Ezra adjusted his grip, keeping one arm secure around the child while guiding his mount with the other. In his free hand, he held his walking staff, a piece of mountain ash he'd carved years ago during his first winter alone. The wood was smooth from use, worn to a comfortable grip that had seen him through countless miles of wilderness travel. Every notch and groove told a story of survival, of a man learning to live with only the mountains for company. The trail climbed steadily through country that grew wilder with each mile. Here civilization was just a memory, and the only law was the ancient understanding between predator and prey, between those who adapted and those who perished. Ezra had chosen this remote corner of the Beartooth Mountains deliberately, seeking distance from a world that had taken everything he valued. His cabin sat in a hidden valley, accessible only by this single treacherous path. He'd built it with his own hands 15 years ago, when Sarah was still alive and their children still filled the mountain air with laughter. Every log had been cut, notched and fitted with the careful attention of a man building not just shelter, but sanctuary. The boy stirred against his chest, mumbling words in a language Ezra didn't recognize. The fever had returned, making the child's skin burn through his thin clothing. Ezra pressed his horse to move faster, though he knew the danger of rushing on these narrow ledges where one misplaced hoof could send them tumbling into the rocky canyon below. As they climbed higher, memories rose unbidden from the places Ezra usually kept them buried. He remembered carrying his own son David this same way when the boy was 6, delirious with the fever that would eventually claim him. He remembered his daughter Emma's last words, spoken in a whisper so soft he'd had to lean close to hear her say she wasn't afraid because Papa would take care of everything. But Papa hadn't taken care of everything. Papa had watched helplessly as influenza swept through their mountain home like wildfire, taking first David, then little Emma, and finally Sarah herself. When spring came, Ezra had buried them in the meadow behind the cabin and sworn he'd never again let himself care for anything he could lose. Yet here he was, carrying another child up the mountain, breaking that solemn vow with every step his horse took toward home. The first snowflakes began to fall as they reached the final approach to the cabin. Fat, lazy flakes that spoke of the serious weather to come. Winter arrived early in the high country, and it stayed late, testing everything that dared to remain in its domain. Ezra felt the boy shiver against him and urged his horse into the last stretch. The cabin emerged from the gathering dusk, like something born from the mountain itself. Built of local timber and chinked with mountain clay, it blended so naturally with its surroundings that travelers could pass within 50 yards and never see it. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but Ezra had been away for 3 days, and the fire had long since died to cold ash. He dismounted carefully, lifting the unconscious boy with gentle hands. The child was burning with fever now, his breathing rapid and shallow. Ezra pushed through the cabin door and into the familiar darkness of home. The place smelled of cold ashes and the lingering scent of pine that seemed permanently embedded in the logs. Working by touch, Ezra laid the boy on his own bed and quickly built up the fire. Orange light danced across walls lined with the tools of mountain survival: traps, fishing gear, hunting rifles, and shelves of preserved food. This was a place built for endurance, for weathering the storms that drove lesser men to surrender. As the flames took hold, Ezra got his first clear look at the child's face in the firelight. The boy's features held a delicate strength that reminded him of the carved bone figures Sarah used to collect. There was something about the shape of his eyes, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, that suggested heritage beyond the pale settlements of the valley below. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters and announcing winter's early arrival. Ezra looked at the sick child on his bed and wondered if he'd just carried home salvation or heartbreak. In the mountains, he'd learned, they were often the same thing. The fever struck like a mountain storm, sudden and merciless. Ezra spent the night moving between the stove and the bedside, boiling water, brewing willow bark tea, and applying cool cloths to the boy's burning forehead. The child thrashed in delirium, speaking in fragments of what sounded like several different languages, none of which Ezra could understand. By midnight, the boy's temperature had climbed so high that Ezra feared he might not see dawn. Working by lamplight, he stripped away the child's fever-soaked clothing and wrapped him in cool, damp sheets. The boy's ribs showed clearly beneath his pale skin, each breath a visible effort that made Ezra's chest tighten with familiar dread. From the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, Ezra pulled out Sarah's quilt. She'd stitched it during her first pregnancy, working by candlelight through the long winter evenings when the snow piled deep against their windows. The pattern told the story of their life together. Blocks of fabric cut from her wedding dress, pieces of David's first shirt, scraps from Emma's favorite pinafore. It was the most precious thing in the cabin, saved for the coldest nights when ordinary blankets weren't enough. Ezra hesitated only a moment before wrapping the quilt around the boy's shivering form. Sarah would have understood. She'd always said their home should be a place of healing, not a museum for grief. The boy's delirium grew worse as the night wore on. He called out words that might have been names, his voice rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. Sometimes he seemed to be pleading, other times warning, his small hands reaching for things only he could see. Ezra held those hands steady, feeling how they burned like coals against his weathered palms. Around 3 in the morning, the boy began to speak more clearly, though still in that strange language. The words had a musical quality, rising and falling in patterns that reminded Ezra of the chants he'd sometimes heard echoing across distant valleys. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know that the high country held many secrets, many peoples who moved through the wilderness like smoke. Ezra bathed the boy's face with cool water and spooned weak broth between his cracked lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but some found its way into his throat. The child's body was fighting hard, and Ezra could see the battle in every labored breath. As dawn approached, memories Ezra had tried to bury rose like ghosts in the lamplight. He remembered sitting beside David's bed just like this, watching his son burn with the same relentless fever. He remembered the helplessness, the way medical knowledge meant nothing when death had already marked its territory. He'd lost that fight, and the failure had carved something out of him that never grew back. But this boy was different somehow. Even in his delirium, there was a strength about him that David had never possessed. When Ezra placed his hand on the child's chest, he could feel a heart that refused to quit, lungs that kept drawing breath despite every obstacle. The boy's medicine bag lay on the nightstand where Ezra had placed it after undressing him. Throughout the night, whenever the fever spiked highest, the child's hand would search for it, his fingers desperate to maintain that single connection to whatever life he'd known before the auction block. Just before sunrise, something changed. The boy's breathing grew less labored. His skin felt marginally cooler to the touch. Ezra checked the pulse at his wrist and found it steady, still fast, but no longer racing toward collapse. The crisis had passed, at least for now. Ezra slumped in his chair, exhaustion hitting him like a falling tree. He'd forgotten how tiring hope could be, how it demanded everything from a man and offered no guarantees in return. Outside, the first light of day painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose, the same colors Sarah used to say made the world new again every morning. The boy stirred under the quilt, his eyes opening for the first time since they'd left town. They were dark eyes, almost black, and they fixed on Ezra's face with an intensity that seemed far too old for such a young child. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the mountain man and the boy who'd somehow survived his first night in the high country. Then the child's eyes closed again, but his breathing remained steady, and Ezra knew they'd crossed the first bridge together. There would be others to face, but they'd won this battle against the fever. As the mountain morning filled his cabin with golden light, Ezra allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this story might have a different ending than the last one. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Ezra had never learned to read. Each day brought small victories and setbacks, measured in spoonfuls of broth accepted or refused, in hours of peaceful sleep versus restless fever dreams. The boy's recovery came in increments so tiny that Ezra sometimes wondered if he was imagining the progress altogether. The morning routine became as fixed as the mountain sunrise. Ezra would wake before dawn, stoke the fire to chase away the night's chill, and prepare a thin soup from whatever vegetables remained in his root cellar. Carrots, onions, and potatoes went into the pot with scraps of dried venison, simmering until the liquid held every bit of nutrition the ingredients could surrender. Feeding the boy required patience Ezra hadn't known he possessed. The child could manage only the smallest amounts, and even those had to be coaxed down with gentle persistence. Ezra had carved a special wooden spoon for this purpose, whittling it from a piece of birch during the long hours of the boy's deepest sleep. The handle was smooth as silk, sized perfectly for small hands, though the child was still too weak to hold it himself. The spoon became Ezra's primary tool in their daily battle against starvation. He'd carved a shallow bowl that wouldn't overwhelm the boy's mouth, with edges smooth enough not to irritate cracked lips. Every curve had been considered, every surface polished until the wood felt like water beneath his fingers. It was the kind of careful craftsmanship Ezra brought to everything that mattered. Though he hadn't realized feeding someone could matter this much. Just a little more, Ezra would murmur, holding the spoon steady while the boy struggled to swallow. Your body needs the strength. The child's dark eyes would fix on Ezra's face during these feeding sessions, watching with an intensity that suggested he understood far more than his silence revealed. Sometimes, Ezra caught glimpses of intelligence so sharp it took his breath away. This wasn't a simple child, damaged by illness. This was someone with depths Ezra was only beginning to suspect. After 20 years of living alone, Ezra had forgotten how to gentle his voice, how to move without the efficient economy of a man who answered to no one. He had to relearn tenderness, rediscover the soft words that encouraged rather than commanded. His hands, calloused from decades of hard mountain labor, learned to touch with the lightness of wind through pine needles. The boy began sitting up during the 4th week, propping himself against the pillows Ezra arranged behind him. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he was testing each muscle before trusting it with his weight. Ezra watched from across the room, pretending to busy himself with mending harness leather while stealing glances at this small miracle of recovery. Getting stronger, Ezra observed, threading a needle with sinew. Good thing too, winter's coming hard this year. The boy's head turned toward the window where early snow had begun to dust the pine boughs. His expression held a mixture of wonder and something that might have been memory. When he looked back at Ezra, there was a question in his eyes that had no words to accompany it. "You're safe here," Ezra said, understanding somehow what the boy needed to hear. "Whatever happened before, wherever you came from, you're safe now." The child's hand moved to his medicine bag, which Ezra had placed within easy reach on the nightstand. His fingers traced the worn leather with a reverence that spoke of deep connection, of traditions passed down through generations. Ezra had seen such reverence before in the movements of the Crow and Blackfoot traders who sometimes passed through the lower valleys. As the days grew shorter and the snow fell more frequently, Ezra found himself talking to the boy constantly. He narrated his daily tasks, explained the logic behind mountain survival, shared stories of the animals that shared their high country home. The child listened to everything with focused attention, occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to direct questions. "Smart as a whip," Ezra muttered one evening as he watched the boy arrange kindling in perfect patterns beside the hearth. "Just can't find your voice yet." But Ezra had learned patience from the mountains themselves. Stone didn't yield quickly to water, but given enough time, even the hardest granite surrendered to persistent flow. He could wait for the boy's words, the same way he waited for spring after the longest winters, with faith that some things came in their own time and couldn't be rushed. The morning the boy first stood on his own, Ezra was splitting kindling behind the cabin. He heard a soft thump from inside, followed by the careful shuffle of bare feet across wooden floors. When he pushed through the door, he found the child standing beside the window, one small hand pressed against the glass as he stared out at the snow-covered meadow. "Well, look at you," Ezra said softly, setting down his armload of wood. "Those legs remember their job after all." The boy turned, swaying slightly but maintaining his balance. His face had filled out over the past weeks, losing that hollow, desperate look that had marked him at the auction. Color had returned to his cheeks, and his dark hair, now clean and growing longer, caught the morning light filtering through the windows. But it was his eyes that held Ezra's attention. They sparkled with a curiosity that had been missing during the worst of his illness. The child was seeing his surroundings clearly for the first time, taking in the details of the cabin that would be his home. The boy's gaze settled on something across the room, and he took 3 careful steps toward Ezra's workbench. There, among the tools and leather scraps, lay a stone arrowhead Ezra had found years ago while checking his trap lines. The flint had been knapped with such skill that every edge remained sharp, despite its obvious age. The child reached for the arrowhead with hands that trembled slightly from effort. When his fingers closed around the stone, his entire body went rigid. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, holding the artifact as if it weighed more than the mountain itself. "Found that up near Eagle's Rest," Ezra said, moving slowly closer. "Someone knew their craft, whoever made it. Must be 50 years old, maybe more." The boy's grip tightened on the arrowhead. His eyes closed, and Ezra could see his lips moving silently, forming words that had no sound. It was as if the stone had awakened something deep within him, some memory or connection that went beyond language. When the child opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. He looked at Ezra with an expression so profound that the mountain man felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just recognition, it was remembrance of a world the boy had lost. "Means something to you, doesn't it?" Ezra asked gently. The boy nodded, the first clear response he'd given to a direct question. He held the arrowhead up to the light, examining its edges with the careful attention of someone who understood its purpose. His small fingers traced the knapping patterns with surprising knowledge. Ezra settled into his chair, giving the child space to explore this connection. He'd learned not to rush these moments when the boy seemed to drift between worlds. Whatever memories lived in that young mind were deep and complex, tied to experiences that probably stretched back further than his conscious recall. The boy carried the arrowhead to the window and sat on the floor beneath it, cross-legged in a way that seemed natural as breathing. He placed the stone in his lap and began to rock slightly, a motion so subtle Ezra almost missed it. The movement had a rhythm to it, like a heartbeat or the gentle sway of wind through grass. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the boy seemed completely at peace. The tension that had marked his every movement, the constant wariness of someone who'd learned the world could be dangerous, melted away as he sat with the ancient stone in his hands. Ezra found himself holding his breath, afraid to disturb whatever communion was taking place. He'd seen something similar once, years ago, when a crow medicine man had visited the trading post in the valley below. The old man had held a sacred pipe with the same reverence, the same sense of connection to something larger than himself. The boy's medicine bag lay on the table nearby, and Ezra noticed how the child's eyes moved between the arrowhead and the leather pouch. There was a story here, a connection between the stone tool and whatever secrets the bag contained. But like all the important truths in the boy's life, this one would have to be revealed in its own time. As the morning wore on, the child continued to sit with the arrowhead, occasionally holding it up to catch different angles of light through the window. He seemed to be reading something in the stone that Ezra couldn't see, finding messages in the ancient craftsmanship that spoke to parts of his heritage the mountain man was only beginning to understand. When dinner time came, the boy carefully placed the arrowhead on the windowsill where the light would touch it throughout the day. He ate his soup with more appetite than he'd shown in weeks, and afterward he returned to his vigil beside the stone, keeping watch over this small piece of a world he was slowly remembering. For 2 months, the boy had guarded his medicine bag like a wounded animal, protecting its last hope. He kept it within arm's reach at all times, his small fingers checking its presence whenever he dozed or woke. Ezra had respected this fierce possessiveness, understanding that some things couldn't be forced, only earned through patience and trust. The breakthrough came on a morning when fresh snow had transformed the world outside into crystalline silence. The boy sat by the window, as had become his habit, watching the way sunlight caught the ice crystals and threw rainbows across the cabin walls. The arrowhead rested in his palm, but today his other hand held the medicine bag, his fingers working at the leather ties that had remained knotted for so long. Ezra continued mending a torn shirt, stealing glances from his chair by the fire. He'd learned to recognize the signs when the boy was wrestling with some internal decision. The child's breathing would grow deeper, more deliberate, and his dark eyes would take on a distant quality, as if he was seeing beyond the present moment, into places memory had hidden. The leather ties came undone slowly, the boy's movements reverent as a prayer. When he opened the bag, Ezra caught the scent of herbs he didn't recognize, earthy, complex fragrances that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he reached inside. The first thing he withdrew was a small bundle of dried plants, tied with sinew and wrapped in soft deerskin. Even from across the room, Ezra could tell these weren't common medicinal herbs. The bundle had been prepared with care, each plant selected and preserved according to traditions that stretched back beyond written memory. Next came what looked like small pieces of root, each carved with symbols that meant nothing to Ezra but everything to the boy. The child's fingers traced these markings with the familiarity of someone reading a beloved book. His lips moved silently, forming words in that musical language Ezra had heard during the fever dreams. But it was the third item that changed everything. The boy lifted out a carved bone whistle, no longer than his palm, but intricately decorated with patterns that seemed to flow like water across its surface. The bone was old, yellowed with age, and polished smooth by countless hands. When the morning light struck it, the carvings seemed to come alive, telling stories in a language older than words. The boy held the whistle to his lips but didn't blow. Instead, he closed his eyes and sat perfectly still, as if listening to music only he could hear. Tears began to track down his cheeks, and his whole body shook with emotion too deep for his young frame to contain. Ezra set aside his mending and moved slowly to the boy's side. He didn't speak, didn't reach out to comfort, just sat nearby and waited. Some grief had to be witnessed, not interrupted. "Sacred," the boy whispered, the first word he'd spoken in Ezra's presence. His voice was hoarse from disuse, barely more than breath given shape. "Sacred song," the word hung in the air between them like smoke from a holy fire. Ezra felt something shift in his understanding, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The boy's reverence for the arrowhead, his instinctive knowledge of herbs and natural rhythms, the way he moved through the world with awareness that seemed to extend beyond his physical senses, it all pointed to heritage steeped in traditions most white settlers barely acknowledged. "What kind of sacred song?" Ezra asked gently. The boy's eyes opened, meeting Ezra's with a directness that was startling. "Calling home song," for when he paused, searching for words in a language that wasn't his first. "For when the lost ones need finding." Ezra's throat tightened. He thought of the auction block, of families torn apart by desperation and circumstances beyond their control. How many lost ones were scattered across the frontier, carrying pieces of their heritage like hidden treasures, waiting for someone to help them find their way home. The boy lifted the whistle again, and this time he blew a single, clear note. The sound was haunting, beautiful in a way that made Ezra's chest ache with longing he couldn't name. It was the sound of wind through canyon walls, of water over stone, of all the wild music the mountains knew by heart. When the note faded, the boy looked at Ezra with eyes that held depths no child should possess. "I remember now," he said simply. "I remember what was taken." Ezra reached out slowly and placed his weathered hand over the boy's small one. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what you remember." December arrived like a wolf pack, silent and relentless. Snow fell for 3 straight days, piling against the cabin walls and sealing them into their mountain sanctuary. Ezra had weathered dozens of such storms in his years alone, but this winter felt different with the boy to consider. Every decision now carried the weight of 2 lives instead of 1. The morning ritual began before dawn. Ezra would slip from his bedroll near the fire, careful not to wake the child who had claimed the main bed as his own. The cabin held the deep cold of high-altitude winter, the kind that made exposed skin burn and turned breath to clouds. But Ezra moved through these mornings with practiced efficiency, his hands finding familiar tools, even in darkness. First came the fire, coaxed back to life from the banked coals of the night before. Dry kindling caught quickly, followed by split pine that crackled and hissed as it surrendered its stored sunlight to the flames. The boy had learned to sleep through these sounds, trusting in Ezra's ability to maintain their fragile bubble of warmth against the vast indifference of winter. Next came the daily inspection of their domain. Ezra would strap on the snowshoes he'd woven from ashwood and rawhide, their broad surfaces allowing him to walk on snow that would swallow a man to his waist. The boy watched these preparations with fascination, his dark eyes following every movement as Ezra prepared to venture into the white wilderness beyond their door. The snowshoes were works of art born from necessity. Ezra had learned their construction from a Blackfoot trapper years ago, back when he was still new to mountain life and humble enough to accept wisdom from anyone willing to share it. The frames were bent from green ash, steamed and shaped with the patience only survival could teach. The webbing was strips of deer hide, laced in patterns that distributed weight while allowing snow to fall through. Stay close to the fire, Ezra would instruct before each venture outside. Keep the soup warm, I'll be back before you can miss me. The boy would nod solemnly, understanding that these expeditions weren't choices but requirements. Wood needed cutting and stacking. The root cellar required checking for signs of freezing. The small shed where Ezra stored his traps and tools demanded daily attention to ensure nothing vital was damaged by the cold. But the most important task was checking the trail that connected their hidden valley to the world below. Heavy snow could block their only route to civilization for months at a time. Ezra needed to know whether they were merely isolated or completely cut off, knowledge that would determine how carefully they rationed their supplies. Walking the perimeter on snowshoes had become a meditation for Ezra. The rhythm of his steps, the whisper of snow beneath the woven frames, the way his breath formed clouds that hung in the still air, all of it combined into a peaceful silence that let his mind wander. Often, he found himself thinking about the boy, about the gradual transformation from the dying child he'd carried up the mountain to the alert, curious companion who now shared his days. The boy had begun helping with small tasks around the cabin. His movements were careful but increasingly confident as strength returned to his young body. He'd learned to stack kindling with the precision Ezra demanded, understanding that sloppy work in winter could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. He helped prepare meals, his small hands surprisingly skilled at peeling vegetables and measuring portions. What impressed Ezra most was the boy's instinctive understanding of mountain rhythms. He seemed to sense when storms were approaching, growing restless hours before the wind picked up. He knew which sections of the cabin stayed warmest and moved his activities accordingly. Most remarkably, he appeared to understand the importance of conservation, never taking more than he needed and always helping preserve what they had. During the long evenings when darkness fell early and the wind howled around their walls, Ezra found himself talking more than he had in years. He shared stories of his life before the mountains, tales of the cities he'd known as a young man, and the reasons he'd chosen solitude over society. The boy listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed depths of understanding that continued to surprise his guardian. "Were you lonely?" the boy asked one night as they sat before the fire. Before, Ezra considered the question carefully. "I thought I was done with loneliness," he replied. "Thought I'd traded it for something better." "What's better than not being lonely?" "Nothing," Ezra said simply. "That's what I'm learning." Outside, the wind sang its winter song, but inside their small sanctuary, warmth and companionship held the darkness at bay. The silence bothered Ezra more than he wanted to admit. Not the comfortable quiet of mountains and snow, but the boy's continued inability to speak beyond those few precious words about the sacred whistle. Ezra could see intelligence burning bright behind those dark eyes, could watch the child's mouth form unspoken responses to questions, but the words remained locked away like treasures in a chest without a key. On a particularly long evening when the wind had died to whispers and the fire settled into steady warmth, Ezra pulled out his carving knife and a piece of seasoned pine. His hands needed occupation during these quiet hours, and the rhythmic scraping of blade against wood helped fill the spaces between thoughts. "What should I make?" he asked the boy, who sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, arranging and rearranging the items from his medicine bag in patterns that seemed to hold meaning. The boy looked up, tilted his head in consideration, then pointed toward the window, where moonlight revealed the dark shapes of pine trees against snow. He held up one finger, then another, then made a gesture that could have meant running or flying. "Animals," Ezra interpreted. "You want me to carve animals?" The boy nodded eagerly, the first real enthusiasm he'd shown for anything beyond his sacred objects. He scrambled closer to Ezra's chair, settling on the floor where he could watch every stroke of the knife. Ezra began with a simple shape, letting the wood dictate what creature would emerge. His hands had learned this skill during the long winters after Sarah's death, when carving was the only thing that kept his mind from following dark paths toward despair. The repetitive motion, the gradual revelation of form from formless wood, had become a kind of prayer. The first figure took shape as a bear, squat and powerful, with careful attention paid to the curve of its haunches and the alert set of its ears. When Ezra finished and held it up for inspection, the boy reached out tentatively, then drew his hand back, seeking permission. "Go ahead," Ezra said. "It's for you." Small fingers explored every detail of the carving, tracing the textured fur Ezra had suggested with careful knife work. The boy held the bear to the light, examining it from every angle, then set it carefully on the floor in front of him. He looked up at Ezra expectantly, clearly wanting more. Over the following nights, a menagerie grew from Ezra's patient hands. An elk with proud antlers, a mountain cat crouched low as if stalking prey, a soaring eagle with wings spread wide. Each figure was roughly the size of the boy's palm, substantial enough to handle, but small enough for young hands to manipulate easily. What fascinated Ezra was how the boy used the carved animals. Rather than playing with them as toys, he arranged them in complex patterns that seemed to tell stories. The bear might face off against the mountain cat, while the elk grazed nearby and the eagle watched from above. The scenarios changed daily, but they always had the feeling of narratives with beginning, middle, and end. "You're telling stories," Ezra observed one evening as he watched the boy move the figures through what appeared to be an elaborate hunt. The child looked up and nodded, then began moving the animals again, this time more deliberately. He pointed to the bear, then to himself, then made a gesture that could have meant family or belonging. The elk represented something else, perhaps the white settlers, based on how the boy positioned it apart from the other animals. The eagle seemed to watch over everything, a guardian or guide. Ezra found himself leaning forward, trying to read the meaning in these wordless tales. The boy's arrangements grew more complex as his collection of animals expanded. Ezra carved a wolf, then another, creating a pack. He added a rabbit, quick and clever, that seemed to represent escape or survival. The breakthrough came when the boy began grouping the animals by relationships rather than species. The bear and wolf pack worked together in his stories, while the elk and eagle maintained separate territories. It was then that Ezra realized the child wasn't just playing, he was remembering, using the carved figures to reconstruct memories he couldn't yet put into words. "The bear is your people," Ezra said softly, "your family." The boy's hands stilled. He looked at Ezra with eyes that held depths of loss too profound for such a young face. Slowly he nodded, then gathered the bear and wolves into a tight group, surrounding them with his small hands, as if trying to protect them from invisible threats. For the first time since the night he'd spoken about the sacred whistle, the boy's lips moved in deliberate formation of words, but still no sound came, as if the pathway between thought and speech remained broken. Ezra watched the silent struggle with growing understanding. This wasn't a physical limitation but an emotional one, born from trauma too deep for easy healing. The first tentative warmth of spring arrived like a shy visitor, melting the edges of snowdrifts and coaxing tiny streams from beneath the winter's frozen grip. Ezra felt the change in his bones before he saw it in the world around him. After 20 years in the high country, he'd learned to read the subtle signals that announced winter's retreat and the Earth's gradual awakening. The boy sensed it too, spending longer hours at the windows, watching for signs of life beneath the snow. His carved animals had multiplied over the winter months until they filled a wooden box Ezra had built specially for them. Now the child arranged them in new patterns that seemed to celebrate the coming season, with creatures emerging from carved caves and dens to greet the warming sun. "Time to think about planting," Ezra announced one morning as he examined the small bags of seeds he'd saved from last year's harvest. Corn, beans, squash, the traditional companions that had sustained mountain families for generations. He spread the seeds on the table, checking each variety for signs of mold or damage. The boy approached with curiosity, his fingers hovering over the dried kernels. Ezra selected a handful of corn seeds and placed them in the child's palm. "These will grow tall as your shoulder by summer's end," he said. Each kernel can become a plant that feeds us through next winter. The wonder in the boy's eyes was profound, as if Ezra had just revealed magic rather than simple agriculture. The child examined each seed with the same reverence he showed his sacred objects, understanding somehow that these small, hard nuggets contained the promise of life itself. When the snow had retreated enough to reveal patches of dark earth behind the cabin, Ezra began preparing their garden plot. The work was hard after months of relative inactivity, his muscles remembering the rhythm of shovel and hoe with some complaint. But the boy proved an eager assistant, his small hands perfect for the delicate work of placing seeds at proper intervals. Ezra had learned gardening from necessity, not inclination, but over the years it had become one of his deepest pleasures. There was something about coaxing life from soil that spoke to parts of his nature he'd thought dead. Working alongside the boy brought back memories of teaching his own children these same skills, showing them how to read the soil's readiness and trust in the ancient partnership between human effort and natural abundance. The boy's excitement was infectious. He insisted on carrying the seed packets, treating each one like a treasure. When Ezra showed him how to dig shallow furrows with a stick, the child worked with focused intensity, creating rows so straight they might have been drawn with a ruler. His concentration was absolute, the kind of attention that suggested this work connected to something deeper than mere activity. "My grandfather taught me that corn is sacred," Ezra said, as they placed the kernels in their prepared beds. Said it was the foundation of civilization, the gift that let people settle down and build communities instead of wandering. The boy paused in his work, looking up with interest. He pointed to the corn seeds, then to himself, then made the gesture he'd used before to indicate his people. "Your people grew corn too," Ezra interpreted. The child nodded emphatically, then began arranging 3 corn kernels with a bean and a piece of squash in a pattern that Ezra didn't recognize. But the reverence in the boy's movements suggested this arrangement held significance beyond agricultural practicality. As they worked through the morning, Ezra found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years. Tales of his grandfather's farm in Ohio, where corn grew in endless rows and harvest time brought the whole community together. He spoke of his father's belief that a man who couldn't grow his own food wasn't truly free, and of his mother's skill at preserving the harvest to last through the hungriest months. The boy listened to everything with complete attention, occasionally pausing in his work to watch Ezra's face as he spoke. Sometimes the child would nod or smile, as if recognizing universal truths in these family stories. Other times his expression would grow distant, suggesting that Ezra's words were awakening memories the boy carried but couldn't yet voice. By afternoon their small plot was planted and watered, the dark soil holding promises that wouldn't be fulfilled for months to come. The boy stood at the edge of their garden, his carved animals arranged in a protective circle around the planted area. It was a ritual Ezra didn't understand, but instinctively respected, another glimpse into the complex spiritual world the child carried within his silence. "Now we wait," Ezra said, settling his hand on the boy's shoulder, "and we trust that what we've planted will grow." The boy looked up at him with a smile that held more hope than Ezra had seen in months. For the first time since winter's grip had loosened, both man and child could feel the future stirring beneath their feet like seeds in warming earth. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder, announcing the arrival of the first visitor Ezra had received in over a year. He set down his axe and listened carefully, counting the horses and trying to judge the rider's intentions from the steady pace of approach. The boy, who had been helping stack firewood, froze at the unfamiliar sound and moved instinctively closer to Ezra's side. Sheriff Williams emerged from the tree line on his familiar roan gelding, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight like a signal mirror. He was a good man, fair in his dealings and respectful of mountain folks' desire for solitude, but his presence always meant news from the world below, and in Ezra's experience, such news was rarely welcome. "Afternoon, Ezra," Williams called out as he dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Sheriff," Ezra replied, noting how the boy had positioned himself partially behind the woodpile, visible but ready to disappear if necessary. "What brings you up the mountain?" Williams removed his hat and ran a hand through graying hair. The star-shaped badge pinned to his vest was tarnished with age and wear, its silver surface marked by the kind of scratches that came from years of honest service. The metal had been polished smooth by countless handlings, a reminder of the authority it represented and the responsibility that came with wearing it. Making rounds of the remote homesteads, Williams said, his eyes taking in the tidy cabin, the well-maintained garden, and the small figure watching from behind the wood stack. Spring's a good time to check on folks, see how everyone weathered the winter. Ezra knew there was more to it than simple welfare checks, but he waited for the sheriff to reveal his real purpose. Mountain etiquette demanded patience, even when the conversation carried undercurrents of tension. "See, you've got company," Williams observed, his tone carefully neutral. "The boy from the auction, if I'm not mistaken." "That's right," Ezra replied. "He's doing well, stronger every day." Williams nodded slowly, his experienced eyes taking in details that told the story of the past months. The boy's improved appearance, the obvious care he'd received, the way he looked to Ezra for security and guidance. But the sheriff's expression remained troubled, suggesting his visit carried complications Ezra hadn't anticipated. "Glad to hear it," Williams said. "Thing is, Ezra, there've been some questions asked about that auction, about where some of those children came from." The boy went completely still at these words, and Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with mountain air. He'd known this moment might come eventually, but he'd hoped to have more time before the outside world intruded on their peaceful sanctuary. "What kind of questions?" Ezra asked. William shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to be the bearer of unwelcome news. "Federal marshals came through Timber Creek last month. Seems there's been trafficking of Indian children, families separated and kids sold to settlers without proper legal procedures. The government's taking an interest." Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd suspected the boy's heritage from the beginning, but hearing it confirmed in such stark terms made the danger suddenly real. "And they're looking for specific children. Got descriptions, ages, details about when and where they might have been sold." Williams paused, his eyes finding the boy's hiding place. "Son, would you come out here where I can see you properly?" The boy emerged slowly, his dark eyes wide with fear but his spine straight with inherited courage. He moved to stand beside Ezra, one small hand clutching the man's worn shirt. The sheriff studied him carefully, taking in the child's features with the trained observation of someone who'd spent years identifying people from written descriptions. "What's your name, boy?" Williams asked gently. The child's mouth opened but no sound emerged. He looked up at Ezra with desperate eyes, seeking protection from questions he couldn't answer, even if he'd found his voice. "He doesn't speak," Ezra said. "Hasn't said more than a few words since I brought him home." Williams frowned, consulting a folded paper he pulled from his shirt pocket. "Description matches pretty close, though. Dark hair, dark eyes, about 8 years old, likely of tribal heritage." He looked up at Ezra with sympathy. "I'm sorry, friend. But there are people looking for this boy, people with legal authority and federal backing." The boy pressed closer to Ezra's side, and the mountain man felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. This child had survived winter in the high country, had learned to trust again after whatever trauma had left him speechless. The idea of strangers taking him away to face uncertain fate made Ezra's hands clench into fists. "When?" Ezra asked simply. "Could be any time," Williams replied. "They're working their way through all the frontier settlements, following leads from the auction records. Might be days, might be weeks, but they'll get here eventually." The sheriff's badge caught the light again as he shifted position, its tarnished surface reflecting the gravity of the situation they all faced. That night, after Sheriff Williams had ridden back down the mountain, with promises to delay any official reports as long as possible, the boy approached Ezra with something clutched in his trembling hands. His face was pale with the strain of memories fighting to surface, and his dark eyes held the desperate look of someone trying to communicate truths too important for silence. From within the folds of his medicine bag, the boy withdrew a piece of paper so damaged it was barely recognizable as a photograph. The edges were charred black, and most of the image had been destroyed by fire, but enough remained to tell a story that made Ezra's blood run cold. The surviving portion showed part of a family group, a woman's gentle smile, a man's strong hands, and in the corner a small boy whose features were unmistakably those of the child now standing before Ezra. But it was the burned edges that told the real story. The way the fire had consumed everything except this precious fragment that someone had risked everything to save. Your family, Ezra said softly, taking the damaged photograph with careful hands. The boy nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks as he pointed to the figures in the image. His mouth moved in silent formation of words that wouldn't come, his frustration growing with each failed attempt to speak the names that meant everything to him. Ezra settled into his chair and drew the boy close, studying the photograph in the lamplight. The woman wore traditional dress, intricate beadwork, visible even in the damaged image. The man's hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with tools and weapons, a provider and protector. This had been a family of substance, people rooted in their community and traditions. What happened to them? Ezra asked gently, though he suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. The boy's whole body began to shake with the effort of remembering. He pointed to the burned edges of the photograph, then made a gesture that suggested violence, destruction, loss too complete for words. His hands moved in patterns that seemed to describe fire and running, hiding and fear. Slowly, through gestures and the occasional broken word, the story emerged. The boy's family had lived in a village that white settlers wanted for farmland. When negotiation failed, violence followed. The attack came at dawn, when most of the warriors were away hunting. Houses burned, families scattered, children separated from parents in the chaos of flight and fear. The boy had hidden in a root cellar while his world burned above him. When silence finally replaced the sounds of destruction, he'd emerged to find his family gone, and his village reduced to smoke and ash. The photograph was all he'd managed to save from the flames that consumed his childhood. "How did you get to the auction?" Ezra asked, his voice tight with anger at the injustices this child had endured. More gestures, more broken fragments of memory, men on horseback who gathered surviving children like they were collecting stray livestock. A wagon that traveled for days, carrying its human cargo toward uncertain destinations. The auction block where families who'd lost everything tried to sell what remained of their shattered lives. The boy had been silent since the attack, his voice stolen by trauma too profound for a young mind to process. He'd watched his world end and survived by retreating into protective silence, speaking only to the spirits in his medicine bag and the memories locked behind his frightened eyes. Ezra felt fury building in his chest, the kind of righteous anger that could drive a man to desperate actions. This child had survived genocide only to face the possibility of being taken from the one place he'd found safety and healing. The federal marshals Williams had mentioned might have legal authority, but they had no understanding of what this boy had endured or what he needed to truly recover. "Nobody's taking you away," Ezra said firmly, his weathered hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "I don't care what papers they carry or what authority they claim. You're home now, and home means you're safe." The boy looked up at him with eyes that held desperate hope, mixed with learned caution. He'd trusted before and lost everything. The idea of trusting again, of believing in safety and permanence, required courage that Ezra could barely comprehend. "But I need you to help me," Ezra continued. "If they come asking questions, if they want to take you back to some government school or reservation you've never seen, I need you to find your voice. Can you do that?" The boy touched the damaged photograph with reverent fingers, then looked at the medicine bag that held the last pieces of his heritage. Something shifted in his expression, a hardening of resolve that reminded Ezra that this child was a survivor, someone who'd already faced the worst the world could offer and endured. For the first time in months, the boy's lips moved with purpose, forming words with deliberate care. "I will try," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but filled with determination that surprised them both. Sheriff Williams returned 3 days later, his face grim with news that confirmed Ezra's worst fears. He dismounted from his horse with the heavy movements of a man carrying unwelcome burdens, and the crumpled paper he pulled from his saddlebags told a story that made the mountain air feel suddenly thin and dangerous. "They're close," Williams said without preamble, unfolding what looked like a wanted poster. "Federal marshals reached Cedar Ridge yesterday. They've got bounty hunters working with them, men who don't much care about legal niceties as long as the reward money's good." Ezra took the notice with hands that remained steady through years of practice at controlling emotion. The paper was cheaply printed but official, bearing federal seals and the kind of language that turned human beings into property to be recovered. At the bottom, a reward figure that would tempt desperate men to search every cabin and homestead in 3 counties. Escaped Indian boy, the notice read, approximately 8 years old, dark hair and eyes, may be traveling under assumed identity. Last seen in territorial custody near Timber Creek, federal reward for safe return. The boy, who had been tending their small garden, approached the men with cautious steps. His improvement over the past weeks had been remarkable, color in his cheeks, strength in his movements, and a growing confidence that came from feeling safe and valued. But now that hard-won peace was under threat from forces beyond their mountain sanctuary, when the child saw the bounty notice, his reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went pale as winter ice, and his whole body began to tremble with recognition and terror. He pressed himself against Ezra's side, seeking protection from memories the printed words had awakened. "It's him they want," Williams said quietly. "Description matches perfectly, and the timing fits with when you bought him at auction." Ezra crumpled the notice in his fist, anger overriding caution. "This boy isn't property to be recovered. He's a child who's found a home." "I know that," Williams replied, his tone sympathetic but firm, "but the law doesn't see it that way. These federal boys have jurisdiction that supersedes local authority. When they get here, I won't be able to protect you." The boy's breathing had become rapid and shallow, the kind of panic breathing that suggested memories too terrible for conscious thought. Ezra knelt beside him, placing steady hands on small shoulders that shook with barely controlled fear. "Listen to me," Ezra said gently. "Remember what we talked about. If they come, if they try to take you, what are you going to do?" The boy's mouth moved silently, forming words that wouldn't emerge. The stress of impending danger had pushed him back into the protective silence that had kept him alive through trauma. But his eyes held determination that hadn't been there months ago, the quiet strength of someone who'd found something worth fighting for. Williams shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between official duty and personal conscience. "Ezra, there might be a way. If the boy was legally adopted, if there were proper papers, how long would that take?" Ezra asked. "Weeks, maybe months. You'd need to go through territorial courts, prove fitness, show that the child's best interests." "We don't have weeks," Ezra interrupted. "You said they'd be here soon." Williams nodded reluctantly. "Could be tomorrow, could be next week, but they're coming, and when they do, they'll have legal authority and armed men to back it up." Ezra looked around his mountain home, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the garden where green shoots pushed through dark soil, the peaceful valley that had become sanctuary for a traumatized child. Everything he'd worked to create, everything the boy had learned to trust, stood in the path of men who saw only federal authority and reward money. "What would you do?" Ezra asked the sheriff. "If it was your son?" Williams was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the moral complexity of their situation. His badge caught the afternoon light, its tarnished surface a reminder of the competing loyalties every lawman faced between legal obligation and human compassion. "I'd protect my family," Williams said finally, "whatever it took." The boy looked up at both men with eyes that held understanding beyond his years. He'd learned early that the world could be cruel to those who couldn't defend themselves, but he'd also discovered that sometimes good men stood between the innocent and those who would do them harm. Reaching into his medicine bag, the boy pulled out his carved bone whistle. He held it to his lips and blew a single clear note that echoed off the canyon walls like a call to battle. The sound was haunting and beautiful, but underneath its music lay a message of defiance that both men understood perfectly. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The tension in their mountain sanctuary became thick as storm clouds, pressing down on both man and boy with the weight of approaching danger. Ezra moved through his daily routines with heightened awareness, every sound beyond their valley scrutinized for signs of unwanted visitors. The boy followed his example, learning to read the mountain's moods for warnings that might mean the difference between safety and capture. Ezra pulled his old hunting rifle from its place above the fireplace, a weapon that had served him faithfully through 20 years of mountain life. The Winchester was scarred from use, but meticulously maintained, its action smooth and reliable despite the hard service it had seen. He cleaned it with careful attention to detail, checking the mechanism and counting his ammunition with the methodical precision of a man preparing for war. "Never thought I'd need this for anything but hunting," he muttered, running an oiled cloth along the barrel. But some predators walk on two legs. The boy watched these preparations with solemn understanding. He'd learned to recognize the signs of approaching violence, the way men moved and spoke when conflict became inevitable. His small hands helped organize supplies and ammunition, his movements quick and efficient despite the fear that shadowed his dark eyes. Ezra had begun teaching the boy escape routes around their property, showing him hidden paths through the rocks and places where a small person could disappear while larger pursuers struggled with the terrain. The lessons felt like betrayal of the peace they'd built together, but necessity demanded preparation for the worst possible outcomes. If men come asking questions, Ezra explained as they explored a narrow cave behind the waterfall that fed their valley, you go here first. Wait until you hear 3 short whistle blasts, then 2 long ones. That means it's safe to come out. The boy nodded, memorizing every detail of their emergency plans. His silence had deepened again under the stress of threatened separation, but his eyes remained alert and intelligent. Ezra could see the child absorbing every lesson, filing away information that might save his life if their peaceful world collapsed. The worst part was the waiting. Each dawn brought the possibility of discovery, each sunset the relief of another day's reprieve. Ezra found himself listening constantly for the sound of hoofbeats that would announce their sanctuary's end. The boy grew increasingly agitated as days passed, his sleep troubled by dreams that left him sweating and fearful. On the 4th night after Sheriff Williams' warning, the boy woke screaming from a nightmare he couldn't describe. Ezra found him sitting bolt upright in bed, his small body rigid with terror and his mouth moving in desperate attempts to voice words that remained locked inside his traumatized mind. "Easy, son," Ezra soothed, gathering the child into his arms. "You're safe. You're here with me." But the boy's distress continued to build, his hands gesturing frantically as he tried to communicate something urgent. His eyes were wide with the kind of panic that suggested the nightmare had been more than random fear. It had been warning, premonition, or recovered memory demanding attention. The child pointed toward the window, then covered his ears as if blocking out sounds only he could hear. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, forming words with increasing desperation as his voice remained stubbornly silent. Frustration and fear combined into a storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his small frame. "What is it?" Ezra asked gently. "What are you trying to tell me?" The boy scrambled from the bed and ran to where his carved animals were displayed on the windowsill. He grabbed the figures representing wolves and men, arranging them in patterns that suggested pursuit and danger. His movements were urgent, almost frantic, as he tried to communicate through the wooden symbols what his voice couldn't express. Then, for just a moment, sound emerged from his throat. Not words, but a low, keening cry that spoke of grief and warning combined. It was the sound of someone who'd seen too much, lost too much, and now faced the possibility of losing again. Ezra knelt beside the boy, his weathered hands gentle on small shoulders that carried burdens no child should bear. "I understand," he said softly. "They're coming soon. You can feel it." The boy nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks as he pointed again toward the valley's entrance. His whole body trembled with the effort of trying to speak, of fighting against the protective silence that had kept him safe but now threatened to leave him defenseless when communication mattered most. "When they come," Ezra said firmly, "when we need your voice most, it will be there. Sometimes the most important words only come when everything depends on them." Outside their cabin, the mountain wind carried no sound of approaching riders, but both man and boy knew their peaceful sanctuary's days were numbered. The storm they'd been dreading was finally gathering strength, and soon they would discover whether love and determination could stand against federal authority and the hunger for reward money. They came at mid-morning, when the sun was high enough to eliminate shadows, but not so bright as to create glare that might give their quarry advantage. 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line with the confident bearing of those who believed law and firepower made them untouchable. The lead rider wore a federal marshal's badge that caught the sunlight like a declaration of authority. Ezra had been expecting them, but the reality of armed men invading his sanctuary still sent cold rage through his veins. He stepped onto his porch with the Winchester cradled in his arms, not quite threatening but clearly prepared. Behind him, the boy pressed against the cabin wall, his small hands clutching something hidden within his medicine bag. "Morning," called the marshal, a lean man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his lips. I'm Marshall Garrett, and these are my associates. We're looking for a runaway Indian boy, about 8 years old. Been told you might have information. Don't know anything about runaway boys, Ezra replied, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Just me and my son up here. The second rider, a bounty hunter by his appearance, spat tobacco juice and laughed. Your son? That's a good one, old man. We know you bought that little savage at auction. Federal property, stolen from lawful custody. At the word savage, the boy's breathing became rapid and shallow. The trauma of hearing his people described in such terms, combined with the presence of armed men who'd come to take him away, triggered memories that had been carefully healing over months of safety and care. Boy's not property, Ezra said, his tone hardening. He's a child who's found a home. Marshall Garrett dismounted with practiced efficiency, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. According to federal law, he's a ward of the government, illegally removed from authorized custody. We're here to return him to proper authorities. Proper authorities, Ezra repeated, letting contempt color his words. You mean the same authorities that let his family be massacred? The ones who put traumatized children up for auction like livestock? The third man, younger and clearly nervous about confronting an armed mountain man, shifted in his saddle. Look, mister, we don't want trouble. Just hand over the boy and we'll be on our way. There's money in it for you if you cooperate. Behind Ezra, the boy began to shake with terror so profound it seemed to emanate from his very bones. The sound of these men's voices, the casual way they discussed his fate, the reality of being reduced to a commodity worth reward money, it all combined to push him toward the edge of complete panic. But then something else stirred within the child's medicine bag. His fingers found the small container of tribal war paint that had remained hidden among his sacred possessions, waiting for a moment when ancient courage would be needed more than protective silence. The paint was made from clay and blood, blessed by medicine men who understood that some battles required spiritual as well as physical preparation. Marshall Garrett stepped closer to the porch, his authority backed by the guns of his companions. This is your last chance to do this, easy mountain man. That boy comes with us one way or another. No, Ezra said simply, raising his rifle to a more ready position. He doesn't. The bounty hunter reached for his weapon, but before violence could explode between the men, a sound cut through the tension like lightning splitting a storm cloud. It was a voice, young and clear and filled with more courage than seemed possible from such a small source. Father, the word rang across the mountain valley with the force of absolute truth. The boy stepped out from behind Ezra, his face marked with streaks of war paint that transformed his features from those of a frightened child to something far more powerful. His dark eyes blazed with inherited strength as he looked directly at the marshal. Father, he repeated, his voice growing stronger with each syllable. Father, don't let them take me. The impact on everyone present was immediate and profound. Marshall Garrett stepped back as if he'd been struck, his confidence shattered by the unexpected power of a single word spoken with absolute conviction. The bounty hunters exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly faced with a child who was clearly claiming protection rather than seeking escape, but it was the effect on Ezra that mattered most. The mountain man felt something break open in his chest, years of careful emotional barriers crumbling before the reality of being claimed as family by someone who had every reason to trust no one. That's right, son, Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion he'd thought permanently buried. Nobody's taking you anywhere. The boy's first word had changed everything, transforming a simple kidnapping into something far more complex, the forcible separation of a father and child who'd chosen each other despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. The word father seemed to unlock something deep within the boy's traumatized mind, as if speaking that single truth had broken down the barriers that had kept his memories and voice imprisoned for so long. Standing on the porch with war paint marking his young face, he began to speak in a torrent of words that had been building pressure like water behind a dam. My name is Standing Bear, he said, his voice growing stronger with each declaration. My father was Soaring Eagle of the Lakota people. My mother was Morning Star, daughter of chiefs. I am not property. I am not lost. I choose this man as my father now. Marshall Garrett stared in shock at the articulate child who had just destroyed every assumption they'd made about this situation. The bounty hunters shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly unprepared for a boy who could speak for himself with such eloquence and determination. Standing Bear reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small bone knife, its handle carved with symbols that told the story of his lineage. The blade was no longer than his palm, but its significance was immediately apparent to anyone who understood tribal customs. This was a warrior's weapon, passed down through generations, a tangible connection to the heritage that violence had tried to sever. "This belonged to my grandfather's grandfather," Standing Bear continued, holding the knife with reverent care. "It has tasted the blood of enemies who threatened our people. It has carved the symbols that mark our sacred ceremonies. It remembers who I am, even when I forget." Ezra felt pride swell in his chest as he watched the boy claim his identity with such courage. The child who had arrived at his cabin more dead than alive had transformed into someone who could face armed men with the dignity of ancient warriors. "My village was burned while the men hunted buffalo." Standing Bear's voice carried pain, but no longer broke under its weight. "Soldiers came saying we must move to reservation land, but my father said this was our home, given by the Great Spirit. They came back with fire and guns." The marshal's hand moved away from his weapon as the boy's story unfolded. Even hardened men found it difficult to maintain aggression in the face of such honest testimony about loss and survival. "I hid in the root cellar like my mother taught me. When the burning stopped, everyone was gone. My family, my friends, my whole world turned to ash and smoke. Men with ropes caught the children who ran, tied us like animals, sold us to people who wanted workers more than sons and daughters." Standing Bear's eyes found Ezra's face, and the love and trust in that gaze made the mountain man's throat tighten with emotion he'd thought himself too old to feel. "This man found me dying and chose to save me. He fed me when I couldn't feed myself, kept me warm when winter tried to claim me, taught me that not all white men see us as less than human. He became my father, not through blood but through choice, through love, through the sacred bond that forms when one person saves another's life." The boy stepped closer to Ezra, the bone knife still in his hands but no longer held as a weapon. Instead, he offered it to the mountain man with ceremonial precision. "In my people's tradition, when a man saves a life, that life belongs to him until the debt is repaid. But this debt can never be repaid, because this man saved not just my body but my spirit. He is my father now, chosen and claimed. No law written by men who never knew loss can break that bond." Ezra accepted the knife with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that he was receiving more than an artifact. He was being given trust, heritage, and the sacred responsibility of protecting traditions that had survived attempts at destruction. Marshal Garrett cleared his throat, clearly struggling with a situation that had moved far beyond simple law enforcement. "Boy, you don't understand the legal complications. There are proper procedures, official channels. You don't understand everything." Standing Bear interrupted, his young voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the worst humanity could offer and chosen love over hatred. "I understand that you see reward money where I see my father. I understand that your laws were written to benefit those who take, not those who save. But I also understand this: I choose where I belong." The bone knife in Ezra's hands caught the sunlight, its ancient blade reflecting light that seemed to carry the wisdom of generations. Looking at this brave boy who had found his voice at the moment it mattered most, Ezra realized that some bonds were indeed stronger than any law men could write. The legal battle that followed took 3 months to resolve, but it ended with papers that made official what had already become true in the hearts of both man and boy. Judge Morrison in the territorial capital listened to Standing Bear's testimony with the gravity it deserved, and when the boy finished speaking, the courtroom sat in absolute silence for nearly a minute. Sheriff Williams had ridden down from the mountains to testify on Ezra's behalf, describing the transformation he'd witnessed in both the man and child. "I've known Ezra McClellan for 15 years, he told the court. "He's as decent a man as ever lived in those mountains, and that boy has found something with him that no government institution could provide." The adoption papers were signed on a crisp autumn morning, with Standing Bear choosing to keep both his tribal name and take Ezra's surname, becoming Standing Bear McClellan in the eyes of territorial law. The document was more than legal formality. It was recognition that families could form through choice and love, rather than only blood and circumstance. The federal marshals withdrew their claim after Judge Morrison ruled that the boy's clearly expressed wishes, combined with evidence of his excellent care and obvious emotional bonds, superseded bureaucratic custody arrangements. Marshal Garrett left the courthouse without the bounty he'd expected, but with what might have been respect for a child who'd shown more courage than most grown men he'd encountered. Back in their mountain valley, the rhythm of daily life resumed with new depth and meaning. Standing Bear helped with the harvest from their garden, his small hands surprisingly skilled at selecting the ripest vegetables and preparing them for winter storage. The corn had grown tall as Ezra had promised, and the boy took special pride in the perfect ears they pulled from stalks he'd helped plant. The carved animals had multiplied throughout the summer, Ezra's evening work producing an entire forest of wooden creatures that Standing Bear arranged in increasingly complex stories. But now the narratives had changed, focusing less on loss and separation and more on healing, growth, and the building of new traditions that honored both mountain wisdom and tribal heritage. "Tell me about your grandfather," Ezra would say during the long evenings as snow began to dust the high peaks. "Tell me about the ceremonies, the stories, the ways your people understood the world." Standing Bear shared what he remembered, his young voice growing stronger as he reclaimed pieces of identity that trauma had temporarily stolen. He taught Ezra words in Lakota, explaining the concepts behind hunting songs and healing prayers. In return, Ezra shared his own family stories, tales of ancestors who'd crossed oceans and continents in search of places where they could live according to their own values. The boy's English improved daily, but he never lost the musical quality that marked his tribal heritage. His voice carried rhythms that spoke of campfires and sacred circles, of a people who understood that words themselves could be medicine when spoken with proper intention. One evening, as the first serious snow of winter began to fall, Standing Bear approached Ezra with something wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside was a new medicine bag, this one crafted by the boy's own hands under Ezra's guidance. The leather was mountain elk hide, tanned using methods that combined tribal knowledge with frontier practicality. "For you," Standing Bear said, offering the bag with ceremony that honored its significance. "A mountain man needs medicine too." Inside, Ezra found items that told the story of their life together. A small piece of quartz from their valley, dried herbs from plants they'd gathered together, a perfectly carved miniature of his own whittling knife, and at the bottom, carefully wrapped in silk, a lock of Margaret's hair that Standing Bear had found in Ezra's private belongings and saved without asking. "How did you know?" Ezra asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Because fathers carry medicine for the families they've lost," Standing Bear replied with wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "And because new families honor the old ones instead of replacing them." The community that had once questioned Ezra's decision now openly admired the relationship between the mountain man and his adopted son. When they came to town for supplies, people stopped to speak with Standing Bear, impressed by his intelligence and the obvious love between father and child. Local children began visiting their mountain home during summer months, drawn by stories of Standing Bear's carved animals and Ezra's patient teaching. The cabin that had once been a hermit's retreat became a place where young people learned traditional skills and heard stories that connected them to both tribal wisdom and pioneer heritage. 1 year to the day after Standing Bear had first spoken the word father, the boy stood before a gathering at the community center in Timber Creek, his voice clear and strong as mountain water. The audience included many of the same people who had witnessed the auction where his new life began, but now they saw a confident young man who carried himself with quiet dignity and spoke with eloquence that commanded respect. "Family is not just the people who share your blood," Standing Bear said, his dark eyes moving across faces that had learned to see him, not as a curiosity or a burden, but as a valued member of their mountain community. "Family is the people who choose to love you when love is difficult, who stand beside you when standing is dangerous, who see your worth when the world tells them you have none." In the front row, Ezra watched with pride that threatened to overwhelm his careful mountain composure. The boy who had arrived at his cabin more ghost than child had become someone who could speak truths that adult hearts needed to hear. Standing Bear wore clothes that blended frontier practicality with subtle tribal elements, beadwork on his shirt cuffs that told stories of his heritage, a bone pendant that carried blessings from ancestors he honored but would never meet. I was taught that some bonds are chosen in the spirit world before we arrive in this one, Standing Bear continued. The father who found me at that auction was not looking for a son. The boy he carried to his mountain home was not looking for a family, but the Great Spirit had already decided that we belonged together, and our hearts simply had to catch up to that truth. Mrs. Henderson, who had once shaken her head at Ezra's foolish purchase, now dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Young Tom Bradley, who had muttered about wasted money, nodded with understanding that came from watching love transform two broken people into something stronger together than either had been alone. From his medicine bag, Standing Bear withdrew a new creation that had taken months to complete. It was larger than his original bag, crafted from mountain elk hide and decorated with symbols that told the story of two traditions joining to create something entirely new. Lakota geometric patterns intertwined with carved representations of pine trees and mountain peaks, creating a visual narrative that honored both his birth heritage and his chosen home. This bag holds medicine for our whole community, Standing Bear explained, holding it up for everyone to see. Herbs that heal, stones that remember, and stories that connect us to the wisdom of all the people who came before us, whether they walked these mountains or the plains beyond them. He opened the bag and began removing items that represented the connections he'd forged over the past year. A small carved bear for Mrs. Patterson, whose granddaughter had been his first friend among the settlement children. A piece of worked leather for the blacksmith who had taught him metalworking during the long winter evenings. Seeds saved from their garden for families wanting to try the three-sister planting method he'd learned from tribal tradition. But the most important medicine, Standing Bear said, reaching deeper into the bag, is the understanding that healing happens when we choose to see each other as family instead of strangers. He withdrew the final item, a perfectly carved wooden heart, no larger than his palm but intricate in its detail. The heart was divided down the middle, one half decorated with Lakota symbols, the other with the simple, practical patterns Ezra favored in his own carving. But the division wasn't a separation, it was a joining, showing how two different traditions could merge into something more beautiful than either alone. My father taught me that the mountains don't care where you came from, only how you choose to live among them, Standing Bear said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. They accept the pine tree and the aspen, the eagle and the elk, the storm and the sunshine. They understand that diversity creates strength, that different gifts combine to make the whole more than the sum of its parts. He looked directly at Ezra, his eyes bright with love and gratitude that had grown deeper with each passing season. Ezra McClellan saved my life when he carried me up that mountain, but he saved my soul when he taught me that family is something you build with love, not something you're born into by accident. He showed me that the word father isn't about blood, it's about choice, commitment, and the sacred promise to stand together no matter what storms may come. The wooden heart caught the lamplight as Standing Bear held it up one final time. This is for everyone who understands that we're all family here, choosing each day to care for each other in the best ways we know how. Outside the community center, snow fell gently on the mountain town, where two traditions had learned to dance together, creating something entirely new under the vast Montana sky.